So we're continuing in our series that we've been looking at Jesus as prophet, as priest, and as king. Jeremy has already looked at Jesus as prophet and Jesus as priest. This is our penultimate episode, if you like. We're going to look at Jesus as king. And then next week, Jeremy is going to kind of wrap up by looking at Jesus as the risen prophet, priest, and king. But today, we're looking at Jesus as king. So I spoke earlier on about King Charles, and we had a picture there of him sitting with a crown next to him but not wearing it. That's because although he's king, he hasn't been officially crowned yet. He's still to have his coronation, and that will take place next month. Now that's a huge event for the nation. We haven't had a coronation for a very, very long time. And the coronation is it's an event of much kind of splendor. There's a lot of pomp. There's a lot goes on in the congregation. And some of it, let's be honest, looks a little bit weird. There's some stuff which is very archaic. There's some stuff which you might wonder why they're doing it. But a lot of that stuff that is going on is there for a reason. Some of it is symbolic. It tells us things about the kind of monarchy we have, about the kind of king we have, about the kind of country we have, and the way we relate to our king. So it's really important that there is all this going on. Now, the passage that we read is quite often read at this time of year. It includes the story of what we call Palm Sunday, the Sunday before Easter. And there is a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of symbolism. There's a lot of things there which tell us stuff about Jesus as king. And all four of the gospel writers include it. They all tell us about it. Now, they all tell us about it from a different angle. They all draw out different things depending on the message that they're trying to send. But what I want to do today is I want to look at this passage and I want to ask a question. I want to ask, what does it tell us about what kind of king Jesus is? So that's what we're going to be asking today. What kind of king is Jesus? And the first thing I want to look at about the kind of king Jesus is that he is the promised king. He is the promised king. What do I mean by that? Well, Jesus didn't come out of the blue. He was promised. From a long time before, he was promised. Now, how do we know that, and how do we get that from the passage that we read? Well, if you look with me at verses 30 to 35 of that passage, if you look and see what it says there, we will read that. At verse 30, it says, Jesus spoke to his disciples, and he said to them, "Go to the village ahead of you. And as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' tell him, 'The Lord needs it.'" Those who were sent ahead went and found it, just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" They replied, "The Lord needs it." They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. Okay, so what's going on there? And why do I say that shows us that he is the promised king? Well, if we look at another verse, if we look at what it says in the prophecy of Zechariah, which was written hundreds of years before Jesus was born, if we look at what it says there in chapter 9 and verse 9, it says, "Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." See, this moment, Jesus riding on this donkey, this colt of a donkey, was prophecy being fulfilled. If we'd read from Matthew's account of these events, he specifically says that. He quotes this prophecy and says Jesus was fulfilling it. But Luke and Mark, they don't draw that out. They just mention what happened. They just talk about what happened, and they kind of assume that their readers will get the reference. That this is not an accident. Because this happened as a result of Jesus' instructions to his disciples. He knew what he was doing. He intentionally fulfilled this prophecy. He was making a claim. He was saying to people that he was the promised king. And the gospel writers recognize this claim. And that's why they include this element, that he was the promised king. Because the Bible is absolutely chock full of promises of this coming king. They start away back in Genesis and they go on and on throughout the Old Testament. God promised David that one of his descendants would sit on the throne. Now, that's not just a promise of a new dynasty to be set up of David's descendants. Yes, God was talking about that. But in amongst that, it's clear that he's talking about someone special, a unique someone who will be an eternal king, a more of a king who will sit forever. This promise of a king to come. And this king, this chosen one, this Messiah, as he would come to be known, becomes a running theme throughout particularly the prophets. Again and again and again, the gospel writers, as they record what Jesus did and what he said, they tie it into the promises that the prophets had brought from God about this promised king who was to come. And it's not just the prophets, though, it's the Psalms as well. The Psalms, they absolutely drip with messianic expectation, with promises of the coming king. Even as they're singing about things that had happened in Israel's history, things from their past, or things that were happening to them right now, or things that were going to come in their near future, they're looking past them. And they are looking forward to the coming of a promised king. Listen to this from Psalm 118. Psalm 118 verse 26 says, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. From the house of the Lord we will bless you." Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Does that sound familiar? Because if we look at verse 38 of the passage that we read there what was being shouted as Jesus rode on his donkey. "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Psalm 118 is a psalm of kingship. At the same time, it thanks God for the king who was placed over the people there and then, but it also looks forward to the promised king, the one who was to come, the Messiah. And here we have it applied to Jesus as he enters Jerusalem. It was a well-known psalm. It was a psalm which people would have been singing at that time of year as it approached Passover. And the people knew what it meant when they applied it to Jesus. The people who said that were recognizing him as the promised king. He's not an upstart. He's not a rabble-rouser who's come out of nowhere. He's not some shocking new development. He was the king that God had been promising since the beginning. He was not a happy accident. And he's not even God's plan B to fix the mess that he hadn't foreseen. He was the promised king. And the writers of the Gospels, they knew that. And they choose their words really, really carefully to show that. They may not have all got it at the time. But by the time they were writing their Gospels, they understood that he was the promised king. And they wanted to make that absolutely clear to us. But, well, he may have been the king who was promised. He certainly wasn't the king that everybody was expecting. And that's because Jesus is a very different kind of king. So that's our second heading. Jesus was a different king. And that's true in a few different ways, and I want to just look at some of them this morning. We're used to talking about this story as the triumphal entry. That's a name that gets thrown around a lot. I think it's probably, might be what it says in our Bibles, the triumphal entry, yeah. But in some ways, it's exactly what it isn't. It's not a triumphal entry in the sense that people would have understood it. Because you see, A triumphal entry in Roman times has a very, very specific meaning. It's a particular thing, a triumph, or as the Romans called it, a triumphus. What that was when somebody had done something really, really amazing for the empire. Perhaps a general had conquered a new land or brought a new people into the empire or crushed an enemy that was threatening them. Or when the emperor wanted to show everybody how grand he was and how amazing he was when he rode into a new province, they would hold a triumph. And what would happen in the triumph is the person who is being honored gets put in a really, really ornate chariot. Really ornate. He would be decked out in all the finest bling. He would have jewelry on him. He would be wearing purple robes probably. He would be wearing a laurel crown to show that he was being honored. The carriage, the chariot he was in would be pulled by war horses in their battle splendor. He would have legions of soldiers marching in front of him and behind him. If he'd conquered a province, he would have prisoners in chains coming along behind his chariot to show how he had dominated them. And the people, all of the people would line the streets and they would shout out his name again and again and again. That's a triumphal entry. That's what people would have understood by this phrase. This great triumph, this show of might, military power and wealth. But that is not what we see here. There's no war horses. There's no chariot. There's no trappings. There's no chained captives. See, the people who were waiting for this promised king, they might have been expecting that kind of king. They might have been expecting a war king to come and throw off the Romans. But see, Jesus' actions, they show him to be something quite different from that. Because as well as the fact that it was a fulfillment of prophecy, the fact that he rode in on a donkey has some other significance for the time. Now, if we were to look quickly at 1 Kings chapter 1, we don't have time to read that today, but we read there about another coronation. We read about Solomon's coronation when he was anointed as king, where he rode in on his father's mule or a donkey. Because in Israel, a king riding on a mule or a donkey would come to symbolize a very specific thing. It was a deliberate statement on behalf of that king to say that he was not going to be a war king. He was a peace king. They would enter a city in peace, and to show they were doing that, they would ride on a donkey. And again, we see that in the words of verse 38. Peace not just on earth, but peace in heaven. Jesus was demonstrating here that he was indeed the king. He was just not the kind of king that people had been expecting and that many of them may have been hoping for. He was setting himself up in contrast to their expectations. And what's really interesting when you think about this triumphal entry is we know from elsewhere in the Gospels that Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of the area, was in Jerusalem for the Passover feast. Now, when he arrived, we don't have a record of that, but let me tell you one thing I'm fairly sure of. He did not ride in on a donkey. He was coming to a conquered province in a show of strength. He would have ridden in splendor and majesty. And Jesus, in total contrast, comes in on a donkey. The humble peace king. But he's also different from all the other biblical kings we've had. He's different from David. He's different from Solomon. He's different from everyone who came after them. We have a list of them in the Bible, and they're all very different themselves. We're used to thinking of them as this one was a good king, this one was a bad king. This one started off well, finished badly. But they all had one thing in common. Every single one of them failed. Even the good kings, the best kings, failed. They did wrong. They didn't live up to what the king should be. And even if we go back before Saul, Israel's first king, we have figures, we have people who weren't called kings, but they had king-like responsibilities. They carried out king-like duties. And all of them pointed to the ultimate king, to Jesus. You might be surprised to hear some of the names on this list, but Adam, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Moses. I could preach an entire series on people who weren't called kings, but really kind of were. They all took on some of the role of a king, and they were all men who failed in some way or another, each and every one of them. But Jesus was a different kind of king, because he is one who will never fail. All the others were like a prototype, but none of them could live up to what a king should be. They were all to show that none of us, no human being, is fit to be king. A king should lead his people, should protect his people, should teach and guide his people, should give them the law and help them to keep it, should stand for his people when they are in trouble, should die for his people. Now, when the people in 1 Samuel first came and asked God for a king, they hadn't had a king before and they wanted one. When they asked for a king, one of the things they wanted was someone who would go out and fight their battles for them. Now, sometimes they got that. But more often what they got is someone who would expect them to go out and fight his battles, who brought them into conflict. Jesus, though, Jesus went into battle on our behalf against the greatest enemy. Jesus took on death for us. And he won. There's another way that Jesus is different. When King Charles is formally crowned, the title that they will use is that he is the King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, head of the Commonwealth, and king of 14 other nations, which I'm not going to list because we could be here all day. It's less titles than his mother held, but it's still quite an impressive list, isn't it? But outside of those territories, he has no power at all. Only courtesy and diplomacy give him any influence, any say. Only they make him anything other than just an ordinary man outside of those territories. And that's the way it is for all human kings, queens, presidents, prime ministers, great dictators. Even for those who within their own region of influence have no apparent limits on their authority, still have borders. But King Jesus is different. His authority isn't constrained by geographical or political boundaries. Jesus' authority knows no limits. His rule extends to the whole world and beyond. The earth and the heavens, the whole universe is his to command. He is a king whose dominion knows no limits because he is different. But there is one more, even more incredible and even more amazing way in which he is the different kind of king. If we go back to that idea of a Roman triumph, of somebody riding there in state, riding there covered in bling, all the trappings of wealth, all that military strength, the crown on their head, and the people cheering their name like they've never seen anyone so magnificent. There's one feature of that triumph which I've always thought was really, really interesting. Because up there on the chariot with him would be a slave, just an ordinary slave, who had one job that day. And their job was throughout that entire day to stand at the person's shoulder who was being honored and to whisper in his ear, "Remember, you are mortal. Remember, you are mortal." And that was a reminder to this person that be you slave or be you emperor or be you something in between, sooner or later, we all share the same fate. So at the height of this person's success, as everybody cheers for them, as they start thinking that there has never been anybody like them before, at the height of that, these words echoing in their ear, remember, you are mortal. Sometimes I think we could do with that, couldn't we? A little voice that whispers that to us now and again. But not Jesus. Every other king, sooner or later, would have that ultimate reminder that they were mortal. War, assassination, disease, old age, plain stupid accidents even. All die. And that's it, over for them. But not Jesus. Oh, they tried. They tried killing him. But death couldn't hold him. That's how far his power extended. Isaiah speaks of the one who was to come, and he says that there will be no end to his government, to his reign, because he is king forever. Oh yeah, he is a different king. But he is also a rejected king. We're used to thinking of this story as having all of Jerusalem turning out to cheer as Jesus arrived. That the crowds lined the streets to cheer him on, to shout, Hosanna in the highest, and blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But if we read the passage more carefully, that isn't actually what it describes. That isn't what it says is going on. If we look at verse 37, what it actually says is that it was his disciples. Now, sure, it says there was a lot of them. There was definitely more than the 12 that we're used to thinking of. There were probably hundreds of them by this stage who had followed him on his journey to Jerusalem. But if you were to compare that to the mass of humanity who would come trampling into Jerusalem at this time of year to celebrate the Passover, well, proportionally, it's not actually that many. For all the people who were cheering for him, there were a lot more who just weren't interested. And again in verse 39, when the Pharisees aren't happy, they ask Jesus to rebuke his disciples. So this isn't the picture of kind of universal acclaim that we might be used to thinking of, that we might have in our heads when we think of this moment, that leaves us wondering how things could turn around so quickly that within the week the same crowd was calling for his death. If it had been like that, if there had been that much of an uproar, then I think we can be pretty certain that the Roman authorities would have acted a lot faster than they did. They would have taken a very active interest if the people were crowning a new king. And to be fair to the Pharisees, that might well be what they were worried about, that things would get out of hand. In fact, when we think about the Pharisees, what's even more striking is that the Pharisees rejected the king. When they saw what was going on, they didn't join the disciples. They didn't encourage the crowd to get with it. They wanted things calmed down. They wanted to keep it quiet. And the reason that I read the longer passage from verse 11 as well is because there's a link between that parable, the parable that Jesus tells, and what would happen next. They're not just kind of randomly banged together. They're connected. If we look again at what it says in verse 28, it says, after Jesus has said this, he went on ahead going up to Jerusalem. After Jesus had said this. Now that's Luke's way of tying the two events together, tying these two elements together. So first, Jesus tells a parable about a man who goes away to become a king somewhere and is rejected by the people who say, we don't want him to be our king. Then he rides into Jerusalem. Jesus knew the majority of the people were going to reject him. We see that play out over the next few chapters as they tell us what happened over the next week. Leading up to the point where the very people who should have welcomed him as king, who should have cheered for his entry, instead call for him to be crucified and nail him to a cross to die. there have always been those who reject Jesus as king. There will always be those who reject Jesus as king. There may even be some of you sitting here today who have been rejecting Jesus as your king. That will continue to be the case until this age ends, that Jesus will be a rejected king by many. And that brings me to my final point, which is a question. Is he your king? I mean, in one respect, the answer to that has to be yes, doesn't it? Regardless of what you might think. Because a king is a king whether you or I acknowledge them as a king or not. They don't become a king because we say so. Otherwise, it's like those people, you might have come across them, they call themselves freemen on the land. And they say that by making that declaration, they are exempt from the laws of the land and they don't have to acknowledge the government or pay any attention to the police or pay taxes or anything like that. Sounds great, doesn't it? Yeah? Let me know how that works out for you, because it's nonsense. That is not how things work. Now, to an extent, human kings rule by consent. The French Revolution showed us that, if nothing else. But it would take a lot more than a dissenting voice at the coronation of King Charles shouting, "I didn't vote for him," to stop things from happening. So a king is a king. Jesus is the king. But the question that I have for you today is, do you acknowledge him as your king? Or do you reject him? Because those are the only two choices. There's no neutral ground. There's no wait and see how it plays out option. Do you accept him or reject him? We either welcome him as our king or we reject him and say, no, we will not have this man to be king over us. Just like the people in the parable. Look at what happened to them. They thought they could just not accept their king. They thought they could just refuse to accept him and say, "King, no thank you, not today." But see how that worked out for them? They were destroyed. Because he is the king. We're told in Philippians chapter 2 that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Everyone will eventually bow to him as king. But what that means for you depends on where you stand on the question right now of, is he your king? Because if you're rejecting him now, then when he comes again, yes, you will bow. But it will be too late then to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I've changed my mind." Because he will come in judgment. And if you have rejected him, then he rejects you. And you will be sent away from him. That is really serious. But if you accept him as your king now, you get to enjoy this life, following and trusting in him, and looking forward to spending eternity with your king. Remember that picture of the inside of Buckingham Palace and how I probably wouldn't even get near the doors without armed guards wrestling me to the ground if I wanted to borrow a book? Jesus says, come and feast with him. Accept him as your king now and look forward to that. Is he your king? Because I tell you right now, that is the single most important question that you will ever have to answer. Is he your king? What kind of king is Jesus? He's a promised king. He's a different king. He's a rejected king. But most importantly of all, is he your king.